Joining me is Dr. William Forstchen, internationally renowned expert on EMP attacks. He's a New York Times best-selling author for the book called 1 Second After. So Dr. Forstchen, with the possibility of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan on the rise, if China does invade, I'm sure the U.S. will be involved in some capacity or another. I mean, just look at Ukraine, right? And, you know, in a war, anything can happen. You're an expert on EMP attacks. Tell us what could happen in this area.
Well, that's the number one worry at the moment, and Ukraine is second. Taiwan, if the Chinese do invade the communist China, we're going to get dragged into it, and that is a nightmare scenario. I pray to God both sides show some restraint in this, because nobody's going to win that kind of war, because the people of Taiwan will fight to the death. It's going to be a terrible battle.
So tell me, as an expert on EMP attacks, what is the danger in this area?
All right, just a quick primer on EMP. EMP is shorthand for electromagnetic pulse. It's generated by detonating a small nuclear warhead 200 miles above the Earth's atmosphere, which then sets up an electrostatic discharge. It's called, the technical term is Compton effect. That discharge cascades down to the Earth's surface, overloads our electrical grid, blows it all out. Now, if there was ever an attack on mainland United States, 2 to 3 small EMP weapons, if detonated, could basically shut down the United States electrical grid for months, even years. 2 congressional studies have shown the casualty rate could go as high as 90% dying within the first year if the continental United States. I think the odds of an EMP attack on Taiwan are lower because it's so close to the coast of China, and there would be a spillover effect on cities on the Chinese coast. I'm not so sure about EMP, therefore, in a Taiwan situation.
Right, and earlier you mentioned how devastating a war, if the U.S. is involved in China's invasion of Taiwan, could be. Now, does China have the capability to do this to the U.S. for EMP attack?
Oh my gosh, yes. I don't mean to cut you off quickly, but that is a big concern. Any nation that possesses nuclear weapons has the capacity, if they can have launch systems, rockets, to, of course, set off an EMP. China has been aggressively researching this. A lot of reports on this, of China aggressively researching EMP strikes. So it is a major concern, but more of a concern for me is a third world player, North Korea. That's a classic one. Or Iran, or even a terrorist group obtaining a weapon and setting it off. That is indeed a nightmare scenario, because China could hand a weapon off, give it to, say, North Korea, but North Korea already has nukes. So it's the unstable third world players that are my biggest concern.
Now, you mentioned 90% of Americans could be impacted. Are we talking about 90% of Americans in the whole country, or just in the area of the weapon?
Okay. Picture what happens is, if you detonate a weapon 200 miles up, the footprint, in other words, the line of sight, would cover the entire eastern United States. 3 weapons, the entire United States. So it would be cataclysmic. We're talking about 90% dying, because if you shut down the grid, electricity is the basic fundamental of any modern society. What happens then? You lose water. Where would you get your, okay, let me ask you a question. You live in Manhattan, right? Or nearby?
I do.
Let's say New York City was EMP'd. Where would you get your water a day from now? Where would you get your food a week from now? If I'm on medication, I have a mild heart arrhythmia, where would I get that medication? All of these things together add up to disaster.
Wow. So your New York Times best-selling book called 1 Second After, I believe, precisely explores the devastation that an EMP attack can cause. What happened to the American society in your book?
What happens to the American society is it disappears because you, again, pull out the fundamental building block, electricity. All communication dies. And with that, chaos starts. The congressional studies, headed by a good friend of mine who just passed away, Dr. Peter Pry, talks about loss of water, loss of food, loss of medication, and command and control. Society starts to break down. Now, in my novel, 1 second after, I set it in a small town in Western North Carolina, the town I live in. But even there, it would still be a catastrophic event. An awful lot of people are going to die very quickly, and society itself will get thrown back hundreds of years. No electricity, no modern society.
Is it even possible to recover from something like this, I wonder?
I think doubtful, because I hate to say the same thing over again. It's a fundamental building block. We lose electricity. How do you call the police? How does your government continue to function when all of its communication systems are down? Let me give one example. They had power failures some years ago. I went up to the nursing home where my father was fighting out the last weeks of his life. Half the staff didn't show up. Why? Because they were cut off, no phone, anything, and they wanted to take care of their families first rather than drive the 15 miles into the city. So everything just starts to disintegrate.
Wow. And how vulnerable is the U.S. Infrastructure to this kind of attack?
Do you want to get depressed? It's a frightening scenario. Look, about 6 years ago, Department of Energy, DOE, did a study on the American infrastructure. The average component in the American electrical and electronic infrastructure, the average component is 40 years old. It's antiquated, the entire system. So let's say a big transformer blows out today, all right? There are no real replacement parts. We have a very low stockpile. So we order a new transformer. This is an interesting point. Order a big new component for your electrical system. Where does it come from? Take a guess. Just take a guess. Where do you think they're manufactured? China.
I don't know, China.
Yeah, of course. Average wait time is 2 years to get a new component in, other than the very small stockpile we have. You think China, if we lost our grid, is going to say, hey, don't worry, America, we're going to send over a whole new replacement for everything tomorrow. They'll just sit back and wait.
That's funny, isn't it? If China does the attack, we're asking China to help with our recovery. That's kind of ironic. How dependent are we in terms of infrastructure on China? I wonder if you know this.
I'm sort of speechless for a second here, and I talk about this all the time. We're totally dependent on foreign suppliers for almost every major component, even some things within the military. So we have, unlike World War II, where America turned to its own industry and made a magnificent fighting machine to save the world, today we have to farm it out around the world and wait for delivery. That's not good.
So let me get this straight. Not only is the U.S. vulnerable to this kind of attack, it doesn't really have any contingency plans either.
Okay. I don't want to get into politics here. Maybe if you were like, I'll forget. But for example, under the last administration, Trump, that administration finally started addressing EMP in early 2019, early 20. And they mandated analysis by DOE, DOD, CIA, all the big initial things to come up with requirements and requests. That was mandated by Trump. The day the current administration came into power under executive order, All of that was canceled. The current administration is spending $1 trillion on infrastructure. I don't see one dime going to hardening and preparing an infrastructure if there was an attack. That's a disaster waiting to happen.
So then, I guess the question is, how do we prepare, right? This EMP attack hasn't happened, so we still have time. How does the U.S. prepare in the short term and the long term?
I'll mention my friend Pry, who just passed away. He was the godfather on this issue for 30 years. Peter said for an investment of $2 to $3 billion a year in 10 years, we could beef up the system enough to make some of it survivable. Now, inflation, everything else. Let's say we spend $50 billion a year. That's still a fraction of $1 trillion. By hardening, it means new relay systems, better circuit breaking systems, better protection, Faraday caging systems, etc. It's not being done. Whereas, as always with American society of late, we just sort of hang on, kick the can down the road a little bit. But we're going to kick the can once too often.
And I think Washington needs to let China know the consequences of actions like this.
Well, I mentioned third world players. For China to launch just an EMP strike against the United States would be suicidal because of what's called mutual assured destruction. We would send 3 or 4 missiles back over China, blow out their power grid. They're almost as vulnerable as we are. But let's say a third world player got into it, North Korea, who for the hell of it said, let's do it, or Iran. And China stands back and says, I don't know anything about this. I had nothing to do with it. At the end of my first of the 3 books on EMP, 1 second after, I have a character talking to another one and saying, oh yeah, North Korea did it and we flattened them. To which my main character replies, does that change anything for us? We're still living in hell.
Wow, maybe let's end on a lighter note. And any hope you see here?
Any hope? Yeah. Get your butts out of the chair, to put it bluntly. Get an administration that starts responding effectively to upgrading the system, protecting the system, sending a very clear message specifically about EMP, saying, don't even think about it. I'm seeing communities, I talked to a statewide consortium last month. They're scrambling with what they have to make the system stronger so that if an EMP hit us, not all of it would be overloaded. Even if 10 or 20% of the electrical grid could survive, that's enough to rebuild from. But if you lose the whole grid, there's nothing left.
What about individual states? Is there something that they can do?
Yes, absolutely, yes. South Carolina, I live in the mountains of western North Carolina. South Carolina is moving to upgrade its systems. I'll be talking with some folks in North Carolina in a couple of months. Their Duke Energy is starting to do things as well. Remember, our electrical grid is private, but it is helped by the federal government. Texas, because of what happened, 2 years ago, is finally doing some things as well to start to strengthen their infrastructure. That's the key thing. If you got $1 trillion for New Deal or green electricity, let's spend even 1/10 of that on securing the electricity we already have.
All right, thank you so much today for enlightening us, Dr. Forstchen. Pleasure having you on.
Thank you so much. It was a great interview with you. Appreciate it.